John, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. It's a long way for me, so I've come all the way from South Africa. We're going to talk about pluralism today. And of course, you're a pluralistic society in Canada, a successful one. And when I landed in Toronto at 1 o'clock in the morning, no, it was actually 11 o'clock, and then, 1 o'clock, and then there's a 37-minute flight, I think, from Toronto to Ottawa. I was quite astounded by just how friendly Canadians are. And I was saying to our colleagues at lunch, when the plane landed in Ottawa, there was a little child with the mother and father on the plane, and the child, of course, as all little children do, when the plane lands, they puke on themselves. And everybody was standing up to leave the plane, and there was a lady in front, and she took some tissue and she gave it to the mother. And then there was another guy in the back, and he said, hold on, and he brought something, and then there was somebody else who brought something. And I said, these are wonderful people. I've never seen such generosity on an aeroplane. You know, people were actually scrambling to assist the mother on this plane. So obviously, pluralism seemed to have worked. And then I got into the cab, and as I always do, because I'm traveling quite a lot, I asked the taxi driver, firstly about the weather, because I told him I thought minus 30 degrees was really bad. But as I got off the plane and walked outside to take the taxi, and I was dressed just like this, you know, we're not a cold continent, so we never know how to dress when we come to cold places. And I just had a jacket on, and it didn't feel that cold. And he said that it was the first time that you had 18 degrees on the 4th of December since 1982. Is that true? So I thought, really, I was lucky. And then I asked him about pluralism, because John and Beverly asked me to speak about pluralism, and he's from Pakistan. So I said, how long have you been here? And he said, 18 years. I said, oh, so you're like Canadian. You can't be Pakistani anymore, you're now Canadian. He said, yes, I'm Canadian. And I said, so how does it feel to be Canadian? You know, are you people like integrated in the society? And I wanted to know whether John's concept document telling me about how good pluralism was in Canada was actually true or not true. And, you know, if I was going to ask Beverly, I wasn't going to get the same answer that I was going to get from the Pakistani taxi driver for two reasons. One, it probably, as a taxi driver, he's a little bit lower down the economic rung. And two, as a Pakistani, he's not as pure-blooded as the rest of the Canadians. So I said, let's just figure this thing out and ask him. And then he said, no, it's wonderful here. It's just cold. He said, it's not easy to live here because it's very cold. But he said, it's a wonderful country. And I said, what about, you know, the Canadian people? They treat you okay and everything? And the comment he made, which for the South African was a very profound statement, he said, they're not racist. Now, you know, South Africans, racism, you know, the whole story. And I found that very profound, and I then came to the conclusion that your pluralism project is actually working. So please give yourselves a big hand. Now, I'm going to do a presentation which is going to try to contextualize for you Africa and where the continent is today in relation to developments on the continent, because you probably hear a lot about it. You see it on Al Jazeera. You don't get Al Jazeera here, right? You don't? You get it? I struggle to get it in the United States. I tried every channel. You don't get Al Jazeera in the United States, right? I've tried, you know, I was in the US 2 days ago in New York, and I kept trying to get it, I couldn't. But you see Africa in CNN, you see it on, and I'm sure most of what you see is all of this ethnic conflict. And then you see all of the corruption on the continent, And probably some of the positive stuff you saw was when the World Cup was played in South Africa, and you probably saw the wonderful stadiums that we built in South Africa. And I should tell you that we built those stadiums out of 3 years of surpluses in our budget that came out of effective revenue collection. And South Africa, we fund 97% of our expenses out of our revenue. And the borrowings that we do are domestic borrowings, not foreign borrowings. So we don't borrow from the World Bank, IMF, or anybody. In fact, we're just about to create a CEDA in South Africa, where we will put a percentage of our GDP into this development agency, and then we will utilize that money to assist other countries. So if you have a disaster in Canada, please feel free to come call on us. We'll see if we can help you. So what I wanted to do was to contextualize the continent and developments on the continent, so you at least have a better picture than what you see on CNN about exactly why we have some of the problems that we have on the continent today, and how we're going to try to resolve those problems on the continent, and what that means in relation to pluralism. So if I can get Frank, who's at the back, is going to assist me with... Frank, are you assisting me with this? Okay. And it's going to be a bit of a trick, so I've got to come down here, I think. Okay, so for all of those who are political science students, this is Political Science 101. And for those who are not political science students, this is Political Science 101. Basically, what it is just to give you an indication of how society evolves and how you've evolved as a society over time, how the rest of the world has evolved over time. We've kind of moved from the agricultural age through industrial society and then information age. And this is Canada's experience. You've moved from agricultural, you've industrialized as a society, you're currently in the information age. Most of Western Europe, most of the North has moved through that trajectory. Forget about the rest of it. It's just that the social contract, which is important here, during the agricultural age was between the monarchs and those that they governed, essentially the feudal system. And then under industrial society brought in the nation state. And today we see the ascendancy of private enterprise under the information age. And this is the trajectory of most of the Western world. I'm going to come back to that when we look at some of the problems we're experiencing on the continent. What this has done, and again, this is typical of northern societies, is it's resulted in the rise of the private sector, rise of private enterprise, and the reduction of the functions of the nation state and the rise of civil society, driven by two things: the globalization of information and the globalization of the market economy. Now, if you take the private sector, for example, and the nation state, you look at, and Rita's written now, just her latest book is on private security. 165 billion, according to you in your book, right? 160, that's what it's worth on an annual basis. So $165 billion on an annual basis is what the private security companies generate with private security. In South Africa, private security companies outnumber our institutionalized police force 2-1. So private education, private security, private healthcare, that's the rise of the private sector, replacing a lot of the traditional roles of the nation state. So the decline of the nation state, getting smaller and smaller, and the rise of civil society. So, today you can have a cell phone and you can be in contact with literally thousands of people around the world through the internet, social media, all sorts of things. And this has given civil society unprecedented power. This again is typical of your societies. We then go to what does a society look like in the North today, given all of those characteristics? And there are three social forces in society. The first is the state, the second is the private sector, and the third is civil society. So if we look at the state in most of the Western world, we see these features. There's a segregation of powers between the administration, the government, the judiciary, the independent courts that you have in your system, and the legislature, your parliaments who make the laws. So there's a separation of powers, and that's one of the cornerstones of any democratic system. Secondly is your military agencies are under civilian control. I'm sure your Minister of Defense is a civilian, is not a general. So, you have them under civilian control. They're a professional military. I've seen your military personnel look very professional also. And you have strong political parties that are based on certain values. And you vote as the Canadian public on the basis of those values. I hope you do, that you don't vote on the basis of identity, because you've evolved to a point where you subscribe either to conservative values, liberal values, Christian values, etc., etc. Then you have a private sector that's sustainable, independent, and diverse. It's not related to just the oil sector in Canada. You have a very diverse economy. It's independent, it's sustainable. You have good infrastructure. You have a regulatory environment. Your civil society, universities, political parties, sports associations, all sorts of civil society institutions, they're pretty independent and strong, well-resourced, and represent a diverse set of interest groups. Now, this is your world. Much of what we're dealing with on the continent today in the evolution of our societies does not have this in place. So there isn't a lot of segregation of powers in many countries. There's a blurring of the lines between the independence of the judiciary, the legislature, and the administration, and political parties for that matter. Military, generally under military control. Your political parties based on identity. Now, the High Commissioner of Kenya is here. He was here early on. But he told us that even in his own country, political parties based on ethnic lines and identity, which then means that ethnic identity in and of itself is not a bad thing, but the politicization of ethnicity is actually a bad thing. And that's what leads to a lot of the conflict. The private sector in a lot of the countries, we don't have a regulatory environment in a number of the countries, hence the corruption that you see. That's why your multinational corporations can do business with the center and pay all sorts of bribes and get away with it. No regulatory environment at the center. Did I say that? Your multinational corporations can do that. But they do, right? That's because we don't have a regulatory environment at the center. And good commercial, physical infrastructure doesn't exist in a number of the countries. And then civil society doesn't exist despite government. A lot of them exist because of government. They're politically aligned. So these are the problems. Now, let's assume we get all of this right on the continent. There are two other factors that you need in order to get stable societies. You need skills and you need resources. So education, education, education. And I'll tell you why you need that education in a minute or two. And then secondly, you need resources. So if I take my own country, South Africa, and we currently have lots of challenges also, we have all of this in place. If you come to South Africa, Hedel, you've been High Commissioner for Canada in South Africa, so you know that South Africa has a separation of powers. Our military, our Minister of Defense was Lindiwe Sisulu, civilian. Our political parties, we're getting there, in terms of values, but you vote for political parties on the basis of a political program in the main. And then all of this in the private sector, we have this in South Africa, highly developed. And then civil society, I belong to civil society, we're pretty independent from the government. We're well-resourced, all of that. We have, as I told you earlier on, we have resources in South Africa, so we're not short of resources. In fact, a lot of our government departments at a lower level return money to the fiscus at the end of the year. Why? Because the one big problem that we have is skills. That's the big problem. That's the education deficit that we inherited from the past, and unfortunately, even in the 16 years, despite the fact, I don't know, Adele, if you put money in education also when you were there, we didn't close that gap. We experimented with a lot of things. We brought in an Australian system called outcomes-based education. Our teachers weren't trained to teach outcomes-based education. We tried to teach the teachers to teach outcomes-based education. So we failed with several experiments in the last 16 years, and we've got a huge backlog in education. So skills is a serious problem for us, and the greatest threat to our democracy in South Africa today is skills. If we don't close that skills gap, we don't have the right pipeline, and that usually takes at least 2 to 3 generations to do. So we're in a race against time to close the skills gap in the country. But everything else is in place. Now, let's look at some of the other countries. So what you need, really, is you need a distribution of power and influence amongst the 3 sectors. And essentially, yourselves, you have that in most of your countries. So let's go to that and look. We're going to take 3 examples. The first is Sweden, and these are employment statistics, by the way. So if we look at Swedes, 27% of them are in the public sector, 62% in the private sector, and 11% in the civil society sector. And there is a distribution of power and influence amongst those 3 sectors. So if you lose elections in government, as the Social Democrats lost elections in the last election, you can migrate to the private sector or civil societies. You can remain as opposition in government, or you can go to the private sector, or you can join a university, become a professor. Not that that's what professors do, is leave politics. Sorry about that, David. You're not a used-up politician. Not yet. So this is what happens in Sweden. And this distribution of power and influence amongst the 3 sectors, access to resources, access to opportunities, all of those things that come with all of this, has resulted in these statistics. You've got a declining population in Europe. It's a good thing in a sense, because we're going from 7 billion to 8 billion people in an unmanageable planet. So declining population is a good thing. You've got huge urban populations in Europe, 73%. That's a good thing, because for industrialization, you need urbanization. Life expectancy is very high. Infant mortality is low. HIV/AIDS is low. Population using sanitation, very high. And your GDP per capita is very high. So this is what this distribution of power and influence has resulted in. Now, here's our problem. A concentration of power and influence at the center. This is the big problem that we have. And what has this resulted in a lot of the situations, is we've got a rapidly increasing population. So Africa close to 1 billion, by 2050, 2 billion. Currently, only 1 country in the top 10 demographically, Nigeria. By 2030, 3 countries in the top 10. Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Ethiopia will be in the top 10 in population-wise. So if we don't solve the problems, we got compounded problems, complex problems. Urban populations, very low. So for industrialization, it's very bad. We're not going to have that. Life expectancy is low. Infant mortality is high. HIV/AIDS, particularly in Southern Africa, is high. Population using improved sanitation, pretty low. GDP per capita, low. And those living below $2 a day, extremely high, 65%. Okay? So this is what we're dealing with. Now, let's take South Africa. In South Africa, you can see we have 18% in the public sector, 23% in the civil society sector, and 59% in the private sector. Now that looks pretty good, right, for South Africa. But if we look at the real situation in South Africa, that's what it really looks like. Only 30% of us in South Africa live in that center. So I live in that center. I have skills, I have access to resources, I can migrate from one sector to the other sector. The rest of the South Africans live on the periphery. What's the consequences of that? The consequences of that is when we have national elections, it's not really a problem. Because those who sit at our national parliament, they have skills, resources, they can migrate from one sector to the other. But once we get down to local government elections and the people who populate our government at a local level, those people, if they lose elections, they lose everything. So we tend to have pretty violent conflict at that level when we have elections. Now, this is just to get past CNN and give you a better context for why we are experiencing some of these problems. And we'll contextualize that just now. Okay? Now, let's take Burundi. Okay? Does anybody not know where Burundi is? It's in Central Africa. Now, I ask that question because I had an embarrassing moment. I had a delegation from Burundi in South Africa. And our African-American colleagues from the US make an annual pilgrimage to South Africa for what they call the African Renaissance Festival. That's hosted by our provincial government. And a group of African Americans, about 100 of them, come with the Reverend Orange, who now passed away, huge guy. And it's a kind of coming home for African American colleagues because of their attachment to the African continent. And so I told the Prime Minister of our province that I have this delegation from Burundi. And I said, you know, I'd like to bring them to the African Renaissance Festival. There were like 8 of them. And he said, please bring them, but bring them to the VIP room before you take them into the festival. So I had the cabinet secretary of Burundi and his delegation. So we went into the VIP room. And there were our African-American colleagues, obviously who have a great interest in Africa and want to help Africa and all of that. And so the Prime Minister said, will you introduce them to the delegation? So I went over to this African-American gentleman and I said, you know, I'd like to introduce so-and-so. He's the cabinet secretary of Burundi. And he said, where's Burundi? I was kind of taken aback, you know. And I said, well, the first thing that came to my mind was, do you know Rwanda? And he said, oh, yeah, man, that place where they killed all those people. And I said, yes, Burundi is next door. Now, we must thank CNN, because if it was not for CNN, he would not have known where Rwanda was either. But CNN repeatedly showed the genocide in Rwanda, so obviously that's how he knew where Rwanda was. So here's Burundi. 61% in the public sector, 35% in the private sector, 4% in the civil society sector. And Carolyn McKinsky is here. She spent quite a few years in Burundi, and she's looking at that and saying, is Vasu totally crazy? It's true. Well, what's really true is that only 5% of Burundians are in this center. 95% of Burundians are on the periphery. Okay? Now, we go back to this. You see this public sector, which is huge now. This is government. Those in the private sector, they are in the private sector not despite government, because of government. So they can't exist unless they have their cronies in government. And the 4% of civil society is the same story. Okay? So what's the consequences of that? Is when you have elections year or year, if you lose in the election here, you lose everything. Now, this is a simple reality of a structural problem that we currently have on the continent. And the consequences of this is what you see repeatedly with cycles of election that lead to violence. It's not because African people are violent. It's not because the hundreds of ethnic groups. When I read the documents, John, and I saw Kenya has 40 ethnic groups. Kyrgyzstan, 70 ethnic groups. I said to my colleague in the office who's a researcher, I said, please go and find out now this ethnic story about Africa having ethnic groups. I don't know about these other European countries. Go and find out in Germany how many ethnic groups they have. He actually came back and told me there were 23 ethnic groups in Germany. I don't know if you know that. But Germany has 23 ethnic groups. So there's ethnicity in Germany too. And if you want to find out about Canadian ethnic groups and all the other countries in the world, there's a website called joshua.com. And I think Joshua has an interest in ethnic groups or something. So if you go look at Joshua, Joshua will tell you about all the ethnic groups in the world. But Germany is able to manage its ethnic groups. Well, at some point in history they got rid of some. But they can manage their ethnic groups. But they didn't get there. They didn't get there without going through 500 years of war in Europe. So I was saying to Rita, are you Norwegian or you just studied in Norwegian? In Norway? You're Norwegian. Yeah, I said the question for us now that we're asking about this situation is, what stage in the development of the continent are we, and how did these Norwegians, who were pillaging, raping, marauding Vikings, you know about that story, right? How did they get to where they are today, being such a peaceful nation? They were pretty good at it also. I was asking someone, tell me these Vikings, just to give you a bit of trivia, how were these, because these Vikings are very legendary in terms of having conquered everybody in that part of the world at the time. And I said, how did they do this? Do you know how they did this in terms of their military formation? You know the wild boar? Seriously. The wild boar. If you look at the wild boar when they attack, they attack in one line. So there's like 5 of them and they run one behind the other. And they kind of just go straight at whatever they're attacking. So generally, military strategists will tell you, cover the left flank, right flank, and, try to rout the enemy, and, you come in from all sides and all of that. Not the Vikings. The Vikings watched the wild boar, and what the Vikings did when they went in a line. And so they just went charging through. And that was the strength of the Vikings. Now, the question is, how did the Vikings get from there to this peaceful Nordic countries? Because when we're looking around the world now for models in Africa, we're looking mainly to the Nordic models because we're saying our big problem now here is inequality. This is our problem. How to close this inequality gap. That's our big challenge. And when we look at inequality, we look at Europe, but Greece and Spain is a big problem now. So we tend to look at the Nordic countries, and the Nordic countries were very successful in closing that gap and building societies that are equitable. Not equal, but equitable. So how do we get to that? And we sat down with economists, and we said to the economists, this center-periphery theory, where you've got an empowered center that continues to be a predatory center. That's our problem. It's a predatory center that colludes with multinational corporations and others. They are extractive in the center. They concession. They take the money, they put it in Swiss bank accounts, and they buy chateaus in France and everywhere else. And that money never gets to these people. So we asked the economists, how do you close this gap? And they said 2 things. The first is education. Because education allows you then to access the opportunities. The second is to create the opportunities. And creating those opportunities requires infrastructure. So the second thing is rolling out infrastructure. That's a big problem on a continent. So here we are. This is the African dilemma. We need to go from where Burundi is to this end of the spectrum. South Africa, despite all of what I told you about the positive things about my own country, we actually went that way this year. Because the latest Gini coefficient figures, which measures income inequality, rose in South Africa. So we actually didn't do that well. And the problem is now, as you move along there, the challenge for us in mediation is how then to manage conflict, to mitigate conflict, and whilst doing that, to transform these societies. So does mediation help in building a pluralistic society? And we had a healthy debate over lunch about the chicken and egg. What comes first? Do you build a liberal democratic society? How do you build a liberal democratic society in this context? Do you build a dictatorship? Do you allow a dictator to come in here, just bring order in the society, and force everybody to go and do this, like they do in Rwanda? And it works. But we had dictatorships in other parts of the continent that were dismal, that led to huge oppressive conditions on the continent. Do we go for multi-party democracy that promotes pluralism? Well, multi-party democracy has led to conflict in a number of places on the continent. So this is our dilemma. How do we move to this end of the spectrum? How do we close that inequality gap? How do we build pluralistic societies? Is the answer multi-party democracy? Is the answer dictatorships? And we look to you Canadians, we look to the Nordics and the other countries that have evolved to that point, so that we don't get to a situation like this. Because you see, largely our problem now is largely most of the continent sits here in the agricultural age. We haven't industrialized, except for South Africa. Except for South Africa. There is no industrialization on the rest of the continent. And the information age, only those people who sit in the center actually have access to that information age. So what happens is, when a president on the continent can sit there for life and act as a monarch, he can be very successful in doing that. Our challenge is how to change that particular situation and move forward from there, and then begin to look at multi-party democracy, etc. And when I say we're looking to you as Canada, we're looking to the Nordic countries, what are we looking for? We're trying to understand how you got to this particular point with liberal democracy, a pluralistic society, a caring society that actually works, an educated population that has industrialized properly, that has created employment, created opportunities, and has a prosperous nation. What is that trajectory? That's what I was saying to the colleagues at IDRC and others. That's the research you can contribute to us to say, at what stage are we in that development that got interrupted at some point by the Cold War, at some point by all of these things, but we'll forget all of that now. We're saying, how do we hold our leaders accountable now? How do we get to this point where you are at? And that's really what we're looking for. So now I'm going to end with pluralism. David, I know that before you shouted me, I'm going to end very quickly with a little poem. This is a dilemma. We're still finding answers to that. In the meanwhile, I thought I'd share this poem with you. I wrote it in 2006. I just come from Petra. Anybody been to Petra? Oh, Jesus, you're a good tourist. You see what prosperity does? You can get on a plane and go to Petra. It's a wonderful place, right? But you know, in Petra, when you walk down that narrow mountain path, you see the different colors of the mountain etched in the stone. So that's what I saw. And then a few months later, I came to Bear Mountain outside New York. How many of you have been to Bear Mountain? Two people actually went to Bear Mountain. Don't you people like Americans? So Bear Mountain, it's just outside New York, in autumn, absolutely stunning. You see all these different colors of leaves. You agree? Now that's what I saw. The different colors of the mountain in Petra, this ancient, ancient city, and the different colors of the leaves in New York, just outside New York, which is much more modern than Petra. So the poem is called The United Colors of Humanity. It's about pluralism. I take photographs of the sunset and sunrise wherever I am in the world. I travel quite a lot every week, so I take sunset and sunrise. That's my passion. So, United Colors of Humanity. Watch the warm sun slowly disappear behind the majestic mountains, bringing darkness over Petra in the land of ancient history. Watch the warm sun slowly disappear behind the majestic hills, bringing darkness over Bear Mountain in the land of modern history. Watch the colorful sand, red, orange, brown, and yellow, baked into the solid mountain, a diversity of colors in a timeless land. Watch the colorful leaves, red, orange, brown, and green, falling through passing time in a diversity of colors in a time-bound land. Colored sand, coloring people, Syrians, Jordanians, Israelis, Palestinians, one region, different nations, a diversity of people evolving with time. Colored leaves, coloring people, Europeans, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, one nation, different nationalities, a diversity of people evolving with time. Different sands, different leaves, different regions, different nations, different people, different nationalities, all a melting pot of differences in a boiling pot of differences. Sunset over the mountains of Petra, sunset over the forest of Bear Mountain, one sun setting over one planet, bringing darkness, fusing many colors through blue, black, and brown eyes, the united colors of humanity. Thank you.